Hello everyone, my name is Alexei Koval, a Ukrainian journalist based in Kiev. Welcome to Reading Initium, a special podcast show for Initium Media 7th anniversary. Every week we will read you a classic article, and in today's episode I'm going to read you an article written at the early stage of the Russia-Ukraine war. Since March 2014, the annexation of Crimea by the Russians, Ukrainians have been living with this sense of inevitability of war. Everyone has become accustomed to it. It may be surprising to a casual observer how the country has continued to develop. However, with the war raging in the front of their eyes, what do Ukrainians really feel? I spoke with 3 Ukrainians with different background, and let's hear what they have to say about the war. It's a strange feeling when you live with a strong sense of the inevitability of war. You understand that it will start, and it may be very soon. Thinking about it can turn your whole existence into hell, a psychological torment that will constantly haunt you. But Ukrainians have been living with this sense of the inevitability of war for 8 years after Russia attacked and annexed Crimea in February 2014. In that time, the sense of the inevitability of war has long been a familiar one. Everyone has become accustomed to it, and so a report of the war that went on in the Donbass no longer evoked much emotion. That is why the feeling of the fear of war, panic, or psychological discomfort was completely absent among Ukrainians until recent days. Even when everyone around began to say that a new big war between Russia and Ukraine was becoming inevitable. It may be surprising to the casual observer how the country, which has been at war for the past 8 years, has continued to develop, expanding its economy, increasing trade, and gathering record harvests. People continued to go to vacations abroad, learn and achieve new things. The war, which was always somewhere nearby, which was renewed and then subsided again, does not affect the lives of most people. This is evidently connected to the hazy to incomprehensible to many foreigners, the absolutely calm reaction of Ukrainians to the approaching war. There was no panic or fear, people simply sat and waited for the inevitable approaching disaster, which was beyond their power to prevent. However, this calm perception of the war that is already there and that is yet to come is only superficial perception, an outward manifestation. In fact, the war and the attitude toward it have deeply divided Ukrainian society. It has long been defined. Some people perceive the war as an unfortunate circumstance that has not prevented them from leading a basically carefree life. For others, the war has become the meaning of their lives, and preparation for this war has not prevented them from living and working. Between these two categories lay an insurmountable chasm. In her everyday life, a young woman Nastya, who looks about 25-27, considers wars a distant event, almost non-existent in her everyday world of entertainment and care. She raises her 1-year-old daughter and spends her time between walks, meeting with friends, and taking care of herself and housework. Her peace of mind comes from not wanting to think about war, to think that war could end her rather idle life, which she and her child are provided for by her husband, a mid-level entrepreneur. But his income is enough for trips abroad with his family and for buying her expensive toys, from the latest model iPhone to small car. On the whole, her life seemed happy and carefree against the backdrop of war. She admitted that she did not consider Russia as enemy, and said that all people are brothers and should love each other, and she does not understand why so many people around her think and talk about war and the threat posted by President Putin's regime. She often communicates with her peers in Russia through TikTok and Instagram and says they are nice and friendly. All of her friends and even relatives' fears about the war were not shared by her. However, When the war broke out, she packed her bags and demanded that her husband immediately take her and her baby to the border with Poland. She had enough savings to sit out the hot phase of the war in Europe, but no one can predict how long this war will last. 2 days after the fighting began, 100,000 people in Ukraine have left their homes and headed to the border of the European Union. Those who remain in the city, surrounded by fighting and bomb and missiles falling from the sky at night, can only hope for good fortune. Kiev residents are praying for peace but preparing for the worst. One of the families that are living at Pictures Hill not far from the Ukrainian capital center is Ania and Grisha. She is Ukrainian and he was born in Belarus. Ania works as an entrepreneur and her husband is a designer. They raise Boris. He is 5 years old. Grisha lives in Kiev for 8 years already. He has relatives in Belarus but considers Ukraine its new home. He says that he still could not believe in what is happening. Grisha says it was not the first time when papers had written about Russian troops near our border, maybe the third for the last year. No one he knew believed that a full-scale war is possible. They thought that was some political game. When Anya started buying food and searching for some cheap car to buy, he still couldn't think that they may need it. He says, and then it was too late. He woke up 2 nights ago and a nightmare appeared to be our reality. No car, some food, some medicines, and luckily they still have electricity and water. They live in an area where the nearest bomb shelter is 1 kilometer away, and there are a lot of houses around it. They didn't even try to reach it. They are sure it is full. So he used it to all materials that were left from flat renovation and closed the windows with gypsum plasterboard sheets. Grisha says now they live in a small hall that has no windows. Luckily they have it and they don't have to hide in the bathroom. Grisha says to me in telegram call, I still keep hoping for a miracle, hoping for Putin to hear all the voices that ask for the diplomatic solution, but seems to be this is not the plan for him. Anya joins the conversation and says, you know I'm ill, with temperature over 38 degrees and cold. I hope it is not a COVID. I hope they don't reach the power station which they tried to hit today. It is 0 Celsius now. Even several days with no electricity and no heating will mean death of a lot of people, especially old ones and children. Their son, whose name is Boris, has a chronic health condition, so they have to visit the hospital twice a week for therapy. They already missed 1 visit as clinic work for emergency cases only. They have some medications, but Anya say she doesn't know that happens when they run out of it. She just doesn't want to think about it. She says, these days she sees no one in the West really cares for Ukrainian people. Sanctions will not stop Putin, it is obvious. And no one in the West will fight for us. No one will come to Kiev with humanitarian missions to help us leave the places that are under fire. There are several trains packed with people, and there are no gas at the stations. Food shops nearby are closed. Anya says, all the world says we are with Ukraine, but it's not true, just some banal kinds of word. She thinks they are left alone, and they only can hope that God will not leave them and wait until it ends. Leonid is a rather famous man in Kiev. He is 34 years old. 8 years ago he worked in Kiev as ordinary cook making pizza in a small pizzeria in the center of the Ukrainian capital. He recalls his feeling when in spring of 2014 he watched on television footage of the Russian army seizing the Crimean peninsula without a single shot being fired. Leonid says he had a feeling of rage mixed with the despair in his soul at the time. It's that feeling when one realizes that one would like to do something at that moment to help, but you realize that you are completely powerless. Leonid says he was not a warrior and could only watch that was happening from afar. After a while, he could no longer watch what is happening while staying in comfort. He went to the front at the height of the fighting in the Donbass. He served for a year, and during that time he was in the hottest battles. He says, "Was I scarred in the war? Yes, very much. When it is hot in the summer, I was panting from the cold, and in the winter, pouring hot sweat." When a ceasefire was signed in Minsk in 2015 and the front in Donbass stabilized, Leonid returned to civilian life. After leaving the service, he opened a pizzeria and started making pizza again, like before the war. Almost like before the war, but not at all. The pizzeria is called Veteran Pizza. He says, war will forever change someone. Along with running a successful business, he is also constantly training at the shooting range to become a more professional military man and get those skills to be able to defend his home against Russians. Days before Russian President Putin actually gave the order to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Leonid says, "Now he is waiting. He is waiting for the Russian talentless leadership to give you, the Russian soldiers, a command to attack, and Ukrainians will have a chance to avenge the Russians for all the things they have taken from them, the lives the Russians have taken and broken." There are quite a few people like Leonid in Ukraine, several 100,000 who have served in the army since 2014 and have a good combat experience. They were waiting for the war, they even wished for it, to finish the job they started 8 years ago and take revenge on the aggressor from the neighboring northern country. Leonid says he has a son and he wants him to grow up in a free country. In doing so, he convincingly rejects any plan by Putin to turn Ukraine into a Russian colony. Inside him, as 8 years ago, anger and hatred still boil up against those who encroached on Ukraine and its people 8 years ago. But today he looks absolutely calm because he has long known and was ready to take up arms on the first day of the war and go to defend his country. The war doesn't choose its goal. It comes to the houses of young and old, and those who are ready to fight and those who are weak and helpless. Any of us can be hit these days, and any of yesterday's peaceful citizens may be forced to grab any available arms and fight for their life. It is not the war of future as futurologists imagine it, with human-like robots fighting against each other. Not even the conflict of professional soldiers fighting for the resources or ideas. It is the same old war when one ruler orders to attack and millions of people are struggling for their lives because of the one person's ambitions. Somewhere in near history we had already seen it. After the war began, I decided to stay in Kiev because it is my hometown, where I was born and have lived for almost half a century. I don't want to leave it, and I'm not going to give anyone the right to take over my city. I'm not a military man, I have never served in army, and naturally I have not killed other people. However, on the second day of the war, I went to the headquarters of the newly formed territorial defense. These are units of local residents to whom the Ukrainian government has decided to distribute weapons to defend their own homes and neighborhoods. At this point, I saw more than 500 people, mostly men but also girls, waiting in their turns for an opportunity to register and receive weapons. As it turned out, the procedure takes more than 5 hours, such a large influx of people. In 2 days, 15,000 guns were distributed in Kiev to strengthen the defense of the city, but I never waited for my weapon. At 10 p.m., the city was under curfew and all civilians had to leave the streets. I headed home through the quiet and evening Kiev bathed in the sunlight. The Russian army is getting closer and closer to Kiev and apparently it is seeking to surround the city, to then demand surrender. At the same time, small groups of Russian special forces and saboteurs enter the city every night to commit acts of sabotage in the city, to attack the Ukrainian military. However, the Ukrainian army and territorial defense units actively resist them, and each such group is completely destroyed. Rockets and bombs are destroying the infrastructure of the city, and even houses of civilians. But in general, there are areas where all is quiet and only distant shot can be heard. At night you can still sleep, you can go to the shelter Or you can sleep at home, putting your bed at the bottom of the cast iron bathtub so that if shell hits your apartment, there is a better chance for surviving and not being wounded. The streets of the city are empty and only military vehicles drive on the streets.